Visitors. So we're in Daniel chapter 6 this morning. We are reaching the halfway point of our series on Daniel. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that our series on Daniel beginning next week with Daniel 7 is going to get weird. Like really, really weird. And we'll talk about that next week. But we've got one last same chapter of Daniel to talk about. And this is arguably the most famous story in the book. Would y'all agree with that? This is by far the most famous story. In fact, Daniel and the lion's den pretty much go together like peanut butter and jelly. Am I right or am I right? I remember when my dad, named Daniel, was preaching, whenever he had a bulletin article or if he had a column in the local newspaper, it was always called Daniel's Den. Right? When my son Daniel was born, someone gave him a stuffed lion for obvious reasons. I mean, Daniel and the lion's den, they go together. And sort of like how I talked about with the story of the fiery furnace, this is one of those stories that we tell children, and it's for reasons that escape me. Because have you thought about the threat that Daniel faced while he was in the den of lions overnight? And what happens to the bad guys at the end? I mean, they get eaten. They get torn apart by these lions. And if you've ever seen Jurassic Park, okay, with the T-Rex, mauling people and ripping limb from limb, this is pretty much what we can expect when we think about the lion's den. And as I talked about with the fiery furnace episode, I have a real and legitimate, this is not a joke, I have a real and legitimate concern that when we study these stories that really just kind of are left to children, that it bequeaths to those stories a bit of innocence that they don't deserve. And especially with this particular story and with the burning bush, I'm afraid that we might walk away with the theme or with the lesson that, oh, well, God just always gets his people out of trouble. I mean, if you're in a lion's den right now, God's going to deliver you and everything's going to be fine. I'm afraid that some people read this story and that's what they come away with. Well, I mean, if I'm ever in affliction, if I'm ever in a dangerous spot, God is going to save me. God is going to rescue me. God delivered Daniel and God's going to deliver me. And that's not always the case, as the annals of Christian martyrs will tell you. God doesn't always deliver his people, now does he? And that's why I love this statement that I came across from one scholar. He said, in telling these stories today, the church must exercise caution lest the relationship with God is reduced to a triumphal commercial transaction. If you do this, then God will do that. When God intervenes, it is to accomplish his purposes, not ours. Boy, that's an important truth, isn't it? When God intervenes, it's to accomplish his purposes and not ours. At the end of the story, we're going to talk about how that this story of Daniel and the lion's den actually bears several parallels to an even more famous story in the New Testament. And that while God chose to save Daniel, he didn't choose to save the other person that we read about in the New Testament. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But in Daniel chapter 6, we are introduced to this story. Now remember that the kingdom of Babylon, the empire of Babylon, has just been conquered by the Medes and the Persians, okay? We read about that in Daniel 5 in the sermon last week. And we found at the end of chapter 5 that the Persian Empire there is headed up by a man named Darius the Mede. Now, there's been a lot of questions as to exactly who this person was. We can pretty much rule out the fact that it was Darius the First, who was a king in the Persian Empire, because he doesn't come around until about 520 BC. And if Daniel served in his administration, then Daniel would have been pretty much around 100 when this story took place, and he's not quite that old. But Daniel is a very old man. Now, to save you a long conversation, here's what my belief is, and this is a view that was advanced by a very well-renowned Old Testament scholar by the name of D.J. Wiseman in the 1950s. He proposed that Darius the Mede is none other than Cyrus the Great, the one that we know who was the king of Persia when they conquered Babylon. He believes that Darius the Mede in Daniel 5 and 6 and Cyrus the Great are one in the same. And he believes that for a couple of reasons. Number one, we know that from historical records, Cyrus the Great was 62 years old when he conquered Babylon. How old is the Darius the Mede when he conquers Babylon? 62 in the book of Daniel. We also learn in Daniel 1, the last verse of chapter 1, I think it's verse 21, it said that Daniel served until the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia. Okay? And then I believe it's in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 1, while the Masoretic Hebrew text refers to Darius the Mede, the Septuagint refers to the king in Daniel 11:1 as Cyrus the Great. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest that for whatever reason, Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Great were one in the same. But in this story, he's called Darius. Darius decided to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, stationed throughout the realm, and over them 3 administrators, including Daniel. These satraps would be accountable to them so that the king would not be defrauded. Now, Esther refers to 127 satraps, so the number 120 isn't all that ridiculous to think about. And these satraps were what we would think about as provincial administrators. We might think of them as governors of territories. And they all answered to one of 3 individuals, Daniel being among them. And these 3 guys were basically responsible for making sure that there were no rebellions, okay? No one was usurping the throne in all of these territories. But also they're responsible for collecting tax revenue and tribute, okay? So they had a lot of duties looking after the king's best interest. And obviously one of their jobs was to make sure that the king was not being defrauded in any way. Daniel distinguished himself above the administrators and satraps because he had an extraordinary spirit. So the king planned to set him over the whole realm. I mean, Daniel is so overwhelmingly qualified and competent and such a trustworthy individual that the king is going to make him, after the king, the most powerful person in the entire empire. Daniel is richly blessed by God's favor. The administrators and satraps, therefore, kept trying to find a charge against Daniel regarding the kingdom. But they could find no charge or corruption, for he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. I mean, this guy's a Boy Scout. He's squeaky clean. We can't find anything on him, but they are really jealous and really desperate to do some damage. Then these men said, "We will never find any charge against this Daniel unless we find something against him concerning the law of his God." Now, I mean, that is a telling statement of a right, upright man, isn't it? We are never going to find anything that we can credibly accuse him of unless it comes to his faithfulness to his God. That's the only thing we might be able to use against him. That's a telling statement. So the administrators of the satraps went together to the king and said to him, "May King Darius live forever. All the administrators of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors, have agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an edict that for 30 days, anyone who petitions any god or man except you, the king, will be thrown into the lion's den. Therefore, your majesty, establish the edict and sign the document so that as a law of the Medes and the Persians, it is irrevocable and cannot be changed." And so King Darius signed the written edict. There's a lot of debate as to exactly what's going on here, but I think it may be pretty simple. We know that no Persian king ever tried to deify himself while he was living. And so it's not as if they are setting up Darius to be a god to be worshipped. Notice rather they say that we just think it'd be good if you made a law, an irrevocable law, by the way, and we'll get to that. But we think it'd be good if you made a law that nobody can pray to anybody, man or God, except you for 30 days. Now notice that they're not asking for a law that will be in force in perpetuity, okay, indefinitely. They're not asking that. This is only 30 days. It's only 30 days, just a month. That's all it is. We're not asking for forever, okay, just 30 days. And certainly some of their requests made sense on some level to the king. You've just conquered Babylon, and you're wanting to curry favor with your subjects. You want to know what they care about and what they're petitioning the gods about. You want to get to know your people. Right? When you're a tyrant, when you're a despot, when you're a king, you want to get to know your people. And so, king, we think it'd be a great idea. You're such a great king, loving king, merciful king, caring king. There's never been a king like you. We think it would be great if everybody just brought their petitions to the gods. They brought them to you instead for 30 days. And so that'd be a great way to get to know somebody. Wouldn't you think? I want to know everything you pray about for 30 days. That'd be a great way to really get to know somebody. King thinks it's a fantastic idea. Just fantastic. I mean, this is a really great idea. You've never had a better idea than this. This is just a really great idea. And so again, for 30 days, nobody can pray to anyone except the king. No one can bring their petitions to anyone except the king. However, what we find in the next verse is that when Daniel learned that the document had been signed, notice his response. He went into his house. The windows in his upstairs room opened toward Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees, prayed, and gave thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And then these men went as a group and found Daniel petitioning and imploring his God. I am fascinated by Daniel's example for several reasons. Number one, notice Daniel did not have a martyr's complex and start doing something just because it was against the law that he hadn't been doing before. Does that make sense? Some people have a martyr's complex, and as soon as the government bans something, well, that's what we're going to do. Oh, come on. Sit down before you hurt yourself. You're not fooling anybody. What a hypocrite. Notice that Daniel is not doing this. Daniel simply continues to do what he has been doing before. Notice he doesn't call attention to it, does he? Well, I've been praying all my life, and I'm about to start now. And, he doesn't become John Wayne in the Bible, and he's like, I'm going to go out on the street corner, and I'm going to pray in front of everybody, prove I ain't scared. I got faith in God. Woo-wee. That's not what he does either. He continues to pray in the privacy of his home, at a window, and this wasn't necessarily, quote, out in the open where just anybody would see him. This was probably guarded off with some sort of lattice structure. In other words, if you wanted to catch Daniel praying, you really had to be really looking for it. Does that make sense to everybody? I mean, these people really had to be making sure that Daniel was indeed praying and breaking the law. I'm also struck by this, and I kept thinking about this all weekend. I want to be very clear. I am not making a judgment call about what churches did or did not do during the pandemic. Okay? I am not making a judgment call. But for the first time, I was struck by Daniel's example. And just follow me with this logic. The government told him he couldn't do something, and we're not banning you forever, just for a short period of time. But Daniel said, I'm sorry, this is what my custom has been all along, and I'm going to keep doing it. I think that's an interesting example. Do you think that's an interesting example? You don't think that's an interesting? I thought it was an interesting example. I'm not making judgments on what other people did, but I found Daniel's example here informative for us as we go forward. The government said, we're not going to tell you you can't do it forever, but for a time you can't do this. And Daniel said, I'm sorry, this is what I've been doing all of my life, and I'm going to continue doing it. I'm not going to be flashy. I'm not going to draw attention to myself. I'm not going to be a burr in the saddle, but this is what I'm going to continue to do because this is my custom. Of course, they were waiting for him. They were looking at that. They went as a group. They found him petitioning and imploring his God. And so they approached the king and asked about, they said, didn't you? I mean, I could, swear we were here. Didn't you sign an edict that for 30 days, any person who petitions any god or man except you, the king will be thrown in the lion's den? The king answered, yes, I faintly remember doing that. As the law of the Medes and the Persians, the order stands, and it is irrevocable. And then they replied to the king, Daniel, one of the Judean exiles has ignored you, the king, and the edict you signed, and for he prays 3 times a day. And as soon as the king heard this, he was very displeased. He set his mind on rescuing Daniel and made every effort until sundown to deliver him. And then those men went together to the king and said to him, you know, your majesty, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no edict or ordinance the king establishes can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you continually serve, rescue you. It struck me as I was first writing and studying this passage that the king of all people in this story is to be most pitied. He is, no joke, the most powerful person in the world at this particular point in history. This is by far the most powerful empire on the face of the planet at that point. He's the king, and he can't do a single thing to save his most favored and trusted advisor and servant. Don't you feel sorry for him? That this big, bad sovereign king is handcuffed by the rules and laws of the Medes and the Persians that can't be revoked? It's a testament to the fact that the biggest, strongest, most powerful people in the world aren't nearly as strong and powerful as they like to think. And that it is only God who has the supreme and ultimate power in the universe. It's just striking to me that the most powerful person in this story is the one to be most pitied because he couldn't do a single thing to save the advisor, the lieutenant, the servant that Daniel was, he couldn't do a single thing to save Daniel. He tried all day. They finally come to the end. They said, you got to do what you got to do. And so he is put into this lion's den. He's sealed inside. And Darius says, may the God that you serve, may he rescue you. Notice how the story continues in verse 17. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. Does that remind you of a New Testament story where a stone was rolled into place to seal another person inside? Okay, and a king sealed it with his own signet ring. What was that same story about the stone rolled over the opening? Was it sealed by a ring? I think so. Okay, and the nobles, and so that nothing in regard to Daniel could be changed. And then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and he could not sleep. I mean, this guy tries Ambien. This guy tries a nice tall glass of milk. I mean, he listened to some of my sermons on tape. Nothing can get him to go to sleep. He's counting sheep, all right? They bring in the dancing girls and the concubines, and they bring everything in, and this guy just can't sleep. Meanwhile, while he's up all night, okay, at the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. And when he reached the den, he cried out in anguish to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, the king said, has your God, whom you continually serve, been able to rescue you from the lions? And I want you to stop right there. I want you to put yourself in the place of the king when he asked that question. Has the God whom you continually serve rescued you? I want you to put yourself in his shoes. And it's that place where we know that God can, but we wonder if God will. We know that God can, but did God do it? We've all been there, haven't we? We've all been in these places between faith believed and faith realized. We've all been in these places where we knew God could do something about it, but we didn't know if he would actually do it or not. And man, I got to tell you, Satan loves to mess with the Christian when he's in that place, doesn't he? He loves to mess with the Christian when we're in that place between promises made and promises fulfilled. And it's really sometimes not even promises. It's just, I know that God could do something about it, but he's not promised explicitly he would do anything. But will God come through for me? Will he not come through for me? Will he not answer my prayer? Prayers offered, prayers fulfilled, prayers realized, prayers answered. The king was in that in-between place. You and I have all found ourselves there. And that's where he was when he asked this question. And the answer came back, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they haven't harmed me, for I was found innocent before him. And also before you, your majesty, I have not done harm. You see, what happened is that the Lord had sent an angel to guard and protect Daniel all night long. And while the king, the most powerful person in the world at that time, who couldn't do anything to save his most trusted servant, stayed all night and couldn't sleep, I imagine that Daniel probably curled up with one of those kitty cats and went right to sleep as if he was at home in his own bed. And maybe he didn't get any sleep. Maybe he and the angel had to pop some popcorn and watch a movie with their hosts. And I would imagine the movie was The Lion King. Don't y'all think that? Don't you think they watched The Lion King? I think they watched The Lion King. Did you know, and I've got to tell y'all, that this is the kind of insight and knowledge of the Old Testament that you can only get from me, but the song, In the Jungle, the Mighty Jungle, the Lion Sleeps Tonight, that actually originated with this story. The original lyrics were, in the king's den, the Persian king's den, the lions sleep tonight. Why are y'all laughing? Y'all don't think that's true? I thought that was true. No. Daniel is emphatic that God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. One has to imagine that his night in that lion's den, on whatever level, was probably more peaceful than the night that the king spent anxiously wondering whether Daniel would survive the night. This incredible miracle, this incredible story of deliverance. And notice how it continues. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to take Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was brought up from the den, he was found to be unharmed, for he trusted in his God. I mean, he didn't even have a bruised pinky. He didn't have a scratch on him. Nothing. He was completely unharmed. Remember the story of the fiery furnace? Their hairs weren't singed. Their clothes didn't even smell like smoke. Daniel is completely unharmed, so total is God's ability to save. Then the king gave the command, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. And here's what I love about the Aramaic language, not exactly Hebrew, but sort of like Hebrew, but the language that Daniel 6 is written in. You see that phrase, maliciously accused? The phrase that's actually used in the Aramaic means the guys that made mincemeat out of him with their words. So think about it this way. The king then gave the command that those who had made mincemeat out of Daniel were brought and thrown into the lion's den. And they get made mincemeat out of by the lions. The author is making a little joke. Don't know why you joke about something so horrible, but there you are. I mean, their children, their wives, they're all thrown in. And you may think, well, that's an overreaction. That's just what they did in that day and time. It was the idea of in the Persian Empire, you paid for the sins of the father, the husband. Okay, everybody in the family suffered. It was that idea of corporate punishment for everybody that had taken part. And so they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Josephus says that the reason that this happened is because when Daniel's brought up out of the lion's den unharmed, his enemies tried to cry foul, saying, well, somebody fed those lions and that's why they didn't eat him. And so to prove that they're wrong, the king has them shipped all the way down to the end of the bottom of the lion's den, and so they're pounced upon to prove that the lions were indeed hungry. The only reason that Daniel was unharmed is because God said, I'm going to send my angel. This will not happen. Notice how the story concludes in the passage that Russ read for us. King Darius wrote to those of every people, nation, and language who live in the whole earth, may your prosperity abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God. And a king is making this declaration. This is incredible. He's the living God, and he endures forever, and his kingdom will never be destroyed, and his dominion has no end. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth, for he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Remember how I said at the beginning of the lesson that a lot of people believe, including myself, that Cyrus and Darius were one and the same individuals. There's actually a way you can translate the word in Aramaic that's translated and. It can also be translated as even. For example, that Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, even the reign of Cyrus the Persian, or that is Cyrus the Persian. So one more little detail that may link the two individuals, making them one and the same. But as we wrap up this lesson, I want us to think about some parallels to a very famous New Testament story. That when Jesus was crucified on the cross, he too was sealed with a stone and a signet ring. He too was falsely accused by his enemies. He too was sent there with with a ruler that just really couldn't do anything about it and just washed his hands seemingly of the situation. Both individuals also had people come to the tomb early in the morning. And yet here's the difference. While God chose to save Daniel, he did not choose to save his one and only unique son, his perfectly obedient son. And the difference strikes me because with Daniel, it proves that God is always present with us and wants to be with us and deliver us from our suffering. But the fact that he was willing to abandon Jesus on the cross and in the tomb, unlike him abandoning Daniel in the lion's den, which he did not, God's willingness to abandon his son, unlike him preserving Daniel, his willingness to abandon his son was because of this. While he wanted to be present with Daniel in his suffering, and while he wanted to deliver Daniel from his suffering, he abandoned his son in the tomb for 3 days because he did not want to abandon us in our sin. And that is a marvelous representative of what Jesus has done for us and God's care and concern for us. That Jesus was willing to be left or abandoned by the Father for a time so that we might be reconciled to God. This story does not prove that God will always deliver us from our suffering, that God will always deliver us from our nasty predicaments, but it does remind us that regardless of what we go through, God is present with us. And whether he chooses to deliver or not, it's always for his purposes and not our own. And that's why when we suffer, we can take advantage of something that Daniel had access to, and that is the blessing of God's presence in our lives. Before we close, I want you to open your songbooks and turn to number 684. 684. Many of you will recognize this as an oldie but a goodie. It's a song that was first written in 1840 and then set to music about 16 years later. Nearer, my God, to thee. One of the reasons why I've always loved this song, however, is that, as some of you may know, it was played by the band on the deck of the Titanic as the ship was going down. The band had been playing all night in the horrible circumstances of the ship sinking, trying to keep people calm. And yet when they realized that it was towards the end, they all began to walk away until the band leader began to play this on the violin, and all the other band members came together to play it with him. As we sing this song, I want you to notice the movement in the first verse of I feel close to God, but only through the cross, and really echoing Jesus on the cross. But then in the second verse, it's as if that I'm going through some difficult times in my life, but I still feel a closeness to God, even if it's in only my dreams, referencing the story of Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, and the ladder of the angels ascending and descending from heaven. And yet in the final verse, it talks about how that we feel a closeness to God even in death. Because we know that even if God doesn't choose us to deliver us from every evil, if God one day chooses not to deliver us from death, we know that we will be in the presence of an almighty God for all eternity. Let's sing this song together. Nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. Though it be a cross that raiseth me, still all my song shall be nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee, though like a wanderer the sun gone down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone. Yet in my dreams I be nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. Or if on joyful wing, cleaving the sky, sun, moon, and stars for God, upward I fly. Still all my song shall be nearer, my God, to thee, nearer, my God, to thee, nearer to thee. It is my hope and my wish and my sincere prayer as your preacher that in every lion's den you may encounter before the Lord calls you home, you can endure it, singing to yourself, indeed, nearer I feel my God to thee. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a Christian already. The Bible says if you're willing to confess your faith in Jesus Christ, turn from your sins, and be buried with him in the waters of baptism, you can leave here this morning as an heir of eternal life and as a friend of God. For many more of you, maybe you're here and you are a Christian, yet you know there are some changes you need to make before it's too late. Perhaps you have a desire to rededicate your life to God. If we can be of assistance or encouragement to you for any reason, we want you to come. As together we stand and as we sing.